lots of things going on around the world that we have to address, and we will. But right now, what's happening in Israel takes the immediate attention.
I'm not running against the president. I'm running for the future. People want it. They're hungry for it. I'm hearing it all over.
So after much prayer and deliberation, I have decided to suspend my campaign for president effective today.
Hello, I'm Ed O'Keefe in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. The Israeli military is moving troops into Gaza as part of the next phase of its war with Hamas. In addition to the increased ground presence, Israel is ramping up airstrikes targeting Hamas's maze-like network of underground tunnels, nicknamed the Gaza Metro. Experts say these tunnels are not only vital to the group's terrorist operations, but also where they're holding hostages. At a briefing today, John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesman, says the U.S. doesn't support a ceasefire at this time. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agrees.
Israel will not agree to a cessation of hostilities with Hamas after the horrific attacks of October 7th. Calls for a ceasefire are calls for Israel to surrender to Hamas, to surrender to terrorism, to surrender to barbarism. That will not happen.
CBS News' Tina Kraus joins us now from Tel Aviv. Tina, what is the mood on the ground for Israelis as the 239 hostages remain in the hands of Hamas?
There's a lot of anxiety here, Ed. We're seeing a lot more of these yellow ribbons, people tying them onto their wrists as a sign of bring these hostages home. People also tying them onto their cars, onto their pets all across the country. A lot of symbolism going on because people want to keep the focus on these hostages who are still in the hands of Hamas tonight. We saw at Jerusalem at the mayor's office, outside his office, there were more than 200 beds set up, each one of them for each of the hostages who is still not home with their family tonight. And I think when I spoke with Israelis around Tel Aviv today, there was a real mix of anger and frustration, dismay for suffering on both sides, but everyone worried that this ground operation in Gaza by Israel could possibly endanger the hostages, and that's what they don't want. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying tonight with the release of the Israeli soldier overnight, he says that it's proof this ground operation is working and that they can keep the pressure on Hamas. He says there may be more hostages brought out.
It's an incredible visual outside the mayor's office there in Jerusalem. There was a hostage video released by Hamas today. What do we know about it?
Well, we know there were 3 women in it. We know they're Israeli women who were taken captive on October 7th from their kibbutz. We know that they were under duress. We don't know if they were told what to say, but they were asking to be freed. Please let us return home to our families. They said that this video, that they had been held captive for 23 days now, which suggests perhaps it could have been shot yesterday. But again, we don't have proof of when this was taken and of what's happening with these hostages tonight, if they are indeed safe. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was quick to dismiss it as cruel psychological propaganda. He said all Israeli hearts are with these women and indeed with the more than 200 others still in the hands of Hamas tonight.
And we're hearing about more clashes between Israeli forces and Palestinians in the West Bank. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and in the occupied West Bank, we have seen 5 more Palestinians killed in clashes with Israeli forces, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. Another Palestinian died. He was involved in a shooting with a settler last week, and he has now died. In the town of Jenin, 4 more Palestinians killed. This was as bulldozers went in for a raid. So since the October 7th attack now, we have seen Israeli forces and settlers have killed 122 Palestinians. That's according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. So a lot of tension there. While all the eyes are on Gaza, there is still a lot going on here in the West Bank, and a lot of people feeling scared for their safety tonight.
Well, Tina Kraus, CBS News in Tel Aviv for us tonight. Thank you, and thank your team. The Biden administration is announcing new sanctions to combat anti-Semitism on college campuses. The Departments of Homeland Security and Justice are partnering with campus law enforcement to track hate-related rhetoric online. The Education Department will now make it clear that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits certain forms of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. These new actions come as the Anti-Defamation League says anti-Semitic incidents rose nearly 400% in the U.S. since Hamas's attack on October 7th. And as the war in the Middle East worsens, debate over U.S. aid for Israel is unfolding now on Capitol Hill. New Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson is pushing for legislation that would merely provide funding for Israel and nothing else.
There are lots of things going on around the world that we have to address, and we will. But right now, what's happening in Israel takes the immediate attention.
Let's start with that. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane joins us here on set. The Speaker and Republicans have released their version of an Israeli aid package. How much would it cost? What's in it? How are they going to pay for it?
$14 billion, and that's the thing. They are going to try to pay for it. They're not going to do this as an emergency funding plan, which is really the history of these types of things. You need more money, you make it happen, you write the check. So the new House Speaker wants to offset that with something else, money stripped from the IRS, from the President's Inflation Reduction Act, a prized part of the President's agenda, and also something the IRS has used to get rid of the backlogs and help raise money through its enforcement. Taking that money away to pay for Israel endangers the Israeli aid, puts it in a very fragile place. It's not going to move through the Senate that way. It's not going to get signed that way. This could get bottled up.
Are we working on the assumption that the House is going to start all this anyway, or could the Senate start it, send it over to the House, and try to jam them?
Wouldn't rule that out, but the House is they're going to move to this week, midweek, could be as early as Wednesday. The House Rules Committee is scheduled a 4 p.m. markup Wednesday afternoon. So this could originate in the House, but this bill, with offsets taken from the IRS, is not going to go through the U.S. Senate. This could get mashed up for quite a while.
And they're playing politics with it right away. He voted against Israeli aid to keep the IRS open. I mean, the Attack Act kind of writes itself if you're a Republican
and separating
trying to take out a Democrat.
And separating it from the Ukraine aid, which the Speaker is doing, also endangers the Ukraine aid, which is in a fragile place.
So this is his first full week as Speaker. What else is on the plate of Mr. Johnson as they reconvene?
A couple things worth mentioning. First of all, they've got to avoid a government shutdown November 17th. He did not vote for the measure that kept the government open September 30th. Now he's got to lead the House through this next wall. Something else, CBS News has learned when he took the job last week, a letter was waiting on his desk inside his new Speaker's office from dozens of House Democrats who told him that in the 3 weeks there was no House Speaker, more than 2,000 people died from gun violence, and that there were more than 30 mass shootings in that 3-week period, and that there has to be some movement by the U.S. House towards gun control. There's nobody who believes a Republican House will make it law, but House Democrats say they want to make some progress now before the election to raise the issue for the election or erode some of the numbers in the opposition. Take a listen to Mike Thompson of California.
The American people want us to do something. The only place this is political, the only place this is partisan, is right here in the United States Capitol. It's unacceptable. And for the Speaker, the new Speaker, to come out and say he's hopeful and he's prayerful at this time, he needs to get a clue. Hope and prayers will not change the situation. We need a Speaker and we need members of Congress with guts that will do the right thing.
And you'll recall when the landmark gun control bill was passed last year, Texas Senator John Cornyn was a key Republican in that. Checked with his office if he's moving towards negotiations again. They say no. And
yet again, as Congressman Thompson alludes to, Congress will do nothing when there are a majority of Americans saying something has to be done. What that something
seems for certain.
To be seen. Yeah. Scott MacFarlane, good to see you. Good luck this week up there on Capitol Hill. Candidates are shifting on both the Republican and Democratic sides of the 2024 presidential race. Coming up, we'll speak with a leading pollster on what the shakeups mean for the primaries. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. The 2024 presidential campaign has seen some comings and goings in recent days. Former Vice President Mike Pence is out of the GOP race, while Minnesota Congressman Dean Phillips has jumped into the Democratic primary. Phillips is officially challenging President Biden for the party's nomination, and he told CBS News he entered the race because he's concerned about polling numbers and a potential second Trump presidency. Let's turn to UCLA professor of political science and Central American studies, Matt Barreto. Matt is also co-founder of BSP Research and a senior advisor to the White House-endorsed nonprofit group Building Back Better. He also conducts polling for the DNC and the White House and has been doing so for several years for Democrats. So he knows a thing or two about Democratic voters. Matt, it's good to speak with you from the other coast, and thrilled to be able to do it in this setting. Our colleague, Robert Costa, spoke with Congressman Phillips about the impact of his campaign. I want to play you a bit of their conversation.
Do you believe that your candidacy could soften the ground for others to get in?
I hope it does. I hope it does. Sincerely hope it does.
Who would you like to see get in?
I would like to see anybody of good character, of principle, someone who has executive experience and legislative experience. And yes, I encourage others, governors, members of the Senate, members of the House, people whose names we may not even know, because this is America, and we need you.
Matt, does your polling suggest that the Democratic primary electorate needs more options?
No, that's not what we're seeing right now. And in fact, I think the description that Mr. Phillips gave is exactly the candidate and nominee that we have, someone of outstanding character who has legislative experience, executive experience. That's President Biden. And I think there have been questions of Mr. Biden's age and Mr. Trump's age, but these are the nominees that we have. And Americans are telling us that they are satisfied and confident in the leadership Mr. Biden has had. And these newcomers, like Mr. Phillips, we don't think are going to have much impact at all on the nominating process.
And in the polling you're doing, and again, you're doing it for the DNC or Biden-aligned organizations, has there been a decline? Go ahead.
I say we have been doing polling, I would say, for organizations on the left generally, not specifically for the presidential campaign. That's just sort of just now getting up and running. But we have seen general satisfaction with the policy outcomes that this White House has been producing. Yes, Americans are asking questions about costs, but I would caution people to interpret questions or frustration about costs with frustrations about Mr. Biden. They have been extremely frustrated at this Congress for not taking actions on getting bills passed, on even just getting basic things done. And so President Biden has been fighting every day for the American public on lowering costs, on lowering healthcare costs, on making sure wages are going up. And right now we're seeing that Americans are slowly starting to see that happen. And that is going to bode well, I think, for President Biden, not just in a silly primary contest here, but for the general election. We're quite confident in those numbers.
Has there been a decline at all in any of the polling you've done among young voters or any other core parts of the Democratic Party's constituency?
Nothing that's out of the ordinary, Ed. You know, this is always the type of question you get about a year out before an election. We saw the same thing in 2011 when people were, really pulling their hair out over President Obama's numbers not being strong enough, especially with Latino voters or young voters. But you saw President Obama and Vice President Biden then close the gap very strongly with young voters and Latino voters in 2012. We're expecting the same thing in 2024. It's extremely early to be looking at, who has a likely voter model over 13 months before Election Day. It just is not possible at this point. So we're very confident with where the numbers are. Yes, the Biden campaign is going to keep working hard every day for younger voters, for voters of color. And by Election Day, we're very confident that with a strong economy, President Biden is going to perform very well.
So what you're saying is that back in 2011, then President Obama was seeing soft support among Latinos, among Black voters, among younger voters.
We saw the exact same trends. We saw the exact same trends in 2011. If you go back to this point in time, including into early 2012, we can go back into the spring of 2012 when there were still questions on what was happening. We had a similar situation. President Obama inherited a weak economy, and he was doing everything he could to turn the economy around. And an economic recovery is hard, and it does take time. But we saw that by 2012, when the Obama campaign was in full force, he really connected well with young voters, with Latino voters, with Black voters. And that made the difference in a very close election. So we're expecting similar things here. There's nothing out of the ordinary right now with some of these poll numbers that people are supposedly fretting about. It's early. And when the campaign is up and running in full force and Americans see the choice, when they're confronted with the choice, we think very strongly that Americans are going to come behind President Obama, that the economic recovery will be in full force, and they're going to vote to reelect President Obama, especially when they
President
see the
Biden,
choices
you mean?
of Republicans. excuse me, President Biden, especially when Americans see the choices on the other side of the aisle that Republicans are offering today.
Real quick, the president continues to make the point, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. If that alternative is Donald Trump or Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis, is that going to be enough to drag people out to vote? Or are they going to need more than that?
Look, elections are always about contrast. You have to decide between one side and the other. We think that President Biden has shown incredible leadership, steadiness, diplomacy at the helm. And when you look at that contrast between Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis, or really any of the extreme candidates the Republicans are offering, Americans are going to be able to make that choice. It's going to be a very easy choice when they see what President Biden has been offering, and the leadership style and the compassion that he has governed with is going to be a critical point for Americans. It is always about contrast. It is always about comparing what the other side has to offer. And right now, you know, it took them 3 weeks to pick a Speaker of the House. The Republicans don't have a lot to offer to the American public.
All righty. Matt Barreto, thank you. We'll talk again soon.
All right. Thank you, Ed.
When we come back, a new poll of Iowa caucus goers says good news for Nikki Haley, but another competitor still looms large. Talk about that after the break. You're streaming America Decides.
We have a country to save. And as you look at that, you look around the world and the world is on fire. I'm going to work hard to make you proud like I always have. And together, we will work on saving our country and getting our country back on track.
Welcome back to America Decides. That was Nikki Haley in her home state of South Carolina, where she formally filed to appear on the Palmetto State's Republican presidential primary ballot. And a new Iowa poll found Haley jumping up to 16%, tying her for second place alongside Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. We are joined now by Shelby Talcott and Robert Costa. Shelby, a 2024 campaign reporter for Semaphore. Robert, of course, CBS News' chief elections and campaign correspondent. Haley, you were in Nevada over the weekend where most of these Republican contenders were. She now appears to be the one to beat, right? Because she's on the rise.
Yeah, the one to beat for
if you're not Trump.
Second place.
Yeah.
And as I talked to a lot of the voters at the Republican Jewish Coalition in Las Vegas this weekend, a lot of them really like her, and they like her because of her foreign policy. And that's kind of a shift from what we're seeing from the faction of the Republican Party, who is more America first, America only, who would never vote for Nikki Haley. This group of Republican voters really wants a 2024 president who's going to stand strong for Israel, and she has made it very clear, both with her background and with what she's arguing for now, that she's going to be the candidate who does that best.
Vice President Mike Pence dropping out over the weekend does what to the rest of the field, based on what you've seen and heard?
Well, to build on what Shelby was saying, former Ambassador Nikki Haley made such a key decision in her career to become the UN ambassador for former President Donald Trump, but to define that position on her own terms. She didn't echo Trump's America First nationalism while she served in his administration. And now at this foreign policy crossroads in the Republican presidential race, she is articulating that traditional conservative worldview. And so to answer your question, Ed, with the departure of former Vice President Mike Pence, perhaps he thinks about where he's going to put his endorsement, his political capital in the coming weeks. Certainly probably not toward Trump, his one-time ally, now critic. Could he put it towards Nikki Haley and give her a lift as someone who is amplifying many of the themes, not exactly the same way, but similar themes to what he ran on?
And of course, they worked together. They were, partners to some extent, like-minded, so perhaps wouldn't be a surprise. But that poll just continues to show his complete dominance, the former president's, in Iowa, as we are also seeing nationally. And he didn't go down at all in these rankings, despite the ongoing legal mess. If anything, it's just the bottom of the field shifting. You were looking at the second choice decisions of these Republicans, because that matters, of course, in a caucus.
Yeah.
What's that telling us?
I think the really big thing, every time I've talked to any of these campaigns over the past several months, their main argument is we just need to be the last person standing, and then we will be the only Trump alternative, and that's where we can coalesce our votes. And what this poll showed is that that's actually not what could happen, because if DeSantis drops out, a huge number of people who want DeSantis for president are going to go back to Trump at this point. And so you have to look at it at that. And that, I think, throws a really big wrinkle into this argument from non-Trump opponents that all I have to do is be the last person standing in this race.
Yeah. On the Democratic side, Dean Phillips just had his first full weekend as a declared presidential candidate. You were with him in New Hampshire. What's the draw like? Is there any appetite for him?
Well, I was having a fun time up there as a reporter in Manchester, New Hampshire on Friday. I had lunch with your colleague, Dave Weigel from Semaphore, along with Jonathan Martin from Politico. And Jonathan has a really astute piece today in Politico where he talks about President Biden's decision to not be on the ballot, which Ed has reported on in New Hampshire, instead focusing entirely on South Carolina. But that could give an opportunity for Congressman Phillips to build some traction in New Hampshire, to get some attention. Now, as Ed has reported, if Phillips or anyone wins New Hampshire, that does not mean they're going to win any delegates, but it could be a jolt. And for someone like President Biden to be beat or to have someone competitive in New Hampshire's never a good look. And there's another Minnesota Democrat in history, Eugene McCarthy in 1968, who famously or infamously, depending on who you ask in the Democratic Party, gave President Lyndon Johnson a bit of a scare when he did well in New Hampshire in 1968. Not in similar circumstances, but the idea of New Hampshire being an opportunity for an outsider, well, it's there again.
And either because of Phillips or in spite of him, there is at least a grassroots attempt to make sure the president wins that New Hampshire Democratic primary with this write-in ballot campaign. I know you've been doing some work on whether or not the president himself actually supports this or would even publicly push for it to succeed.
It's a looming question. And next time Ed's in the White House briefing room, maybe he'll ask Karine Jean-Pierre on behalf of the political reporters here who are
if
not
only
in the
she would take
briefing room.
campaign questions. Yeah,
well,
I would.
It does. You do wonder, does the White House at some point get involved if Dean Phillips starts to catch on? For now, it's the early days for Dean Phillips. But look, 2 or 3 months in politics can be a lifetime.
Yeah. So, Shelby, I'm going to ask you the question that you probably got asked about 9 times between coming home from Las Vegas to getting here by friends, family, your fellow passengers. Pence is out. Who's the next Republican we need to be watching and circling?
It's a good question. We were talking about this earlier. I think Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley are in it for the long haul. I think Tim Scott is in it for the long haul. I know you argued that he might be one to sort of drop out. I could see that because of his polling numbers. So in terms of major kind of tier 1 candidates, and I say that in terms of these are the candidates all kind of fighting closely for second place, I could see Tim Scott being the next major candidate. And then obviously you have some of these lower tier candidates like Asa Hutchinson or Doug Burgum. I think not making the debate stage next week is going to be really notable for those kinds of candidates as well.
I mean, Asa Hutchinson's down to answering phone calls himself. So
It's such a it's a gamble because you think about President Biden in 2020, did terrible in Iowa, did terrible in New Hampshire, but comes back in South Carolina. So if you're someone like Senator Tim Scott, you got to wonder, even if you don't win Iowa or do well in New Hampshire, could you come back in your home state? That's the temptation for Senator Scott.
Shelby Talcott and Robert Costa, thank you both. We end tonight at the White House. That's where some trick-or-treaters are getting Halloween candy from the president and first lady. They're hosting military children and local students. They'll be there throughout the night. But that does it for today. You can stream America Decides Monday to Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern. You're streaming CBS News.